Hey, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing today? I see we have Aluzu here today, or Gloria. Good morning, Sarah. How are you doing? How's everybody doing today? So I got some feedback last night. What do you think? Should I have done the lying? Should I have done the lying, the how to catch a liar with the murderer webinar last night? What do y'all think? Hi, Amin. Good to see you. Hi, Melody. Hi, Nicole. It's good to see everybody. Melody, I guess I've still got you here for live lecture. Are you quitting all activities next week, Melody? Or, okay, you were so bummed? Okay. So, what if I did that webinar tonight? In, would y'all still come? What if I held an extra webinar? It has been a rainy week, hadn't it, Gloria? Terrible, terrible, and messy. It's good to see everybody. Holy cow. Okay. You know what? I'll do that instead. I was just afraid that it would be a little bit too dark with the description of the murders and whatnot. I didn't know how the class would feel about that, and I didn't want to upset anybody. You got A&P at 9:30. Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad you're here for, at least for a half an hour, Melody. That's good. Okay, so you know what? I'm gonna screw it. I'm gonna do that webinar tonight, and you can come if you want, Melody. I don't know if you're able to make it, but I will do the lying webinar tonight. Okay, I don't know if it's good. I've just developed this one, so we'll see what happens. But maybe I'll send that announcement out and do that tonight. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to talk a little bit about motivations, why emotions are important, three classic theories of emotions, and the physiology of emotions. Oh, well, where have you been? Amin's been out of the country and hadn't been able to get to the webinars. I'd be curious to find out where Amin has been. All right. So there's really no set in stone definition of what an emotion is. Talk to different researchers from different fields, you'll find different definitions. However, let's go with the working definition that you'll find online. It's a biological state characterized by neurological changes that lead to a characteristic pattern of feeling, which is affect, thoughts, cognition, and activity or behavior. So it's a biological state characterized by neurological change that affect the way you feel, the way you think, and the way you behave. Why exactly do we have emotions? What does it matter to have emotions? Any of you have ever been disappointed or sad or heartbroken? You've probably wondered why it is we have to have the emotion of sad and unhappy, why we have to have emotions of being embarrassed and other things. Um, but emotions are actually very important. You can think of emotions as sort of guides that help us direct, evaluate, and adjust our behavior. All right. Now, if you think about it, your emotions provide you, the human being, an evaluative interpretation of the environment that you are in. So it allows you to make sense of your environment. That makes me happy. That makes me sad. Why am I doing this? It's because I'm happy. I like it. This somebody must be talking about somebody. So I must be happy or sad, or I must like this environment. I need to leave this environment. So emotions provide us an evaluative feedback of the environment, and they allow us to choose from an assortment of behaviors that we might perform in a given situation. They also provide feedback for self evaluation. How many of you have ever felt proud? How many of you have ever felt guilty? All right. How many of you have ever felt the sadness of failure or the elation of success? Emotions provide us feedback for self evaluation. They allow us to adjust our own behavior in these environments so that we behave more effectively. And if you think about it, emotional displays serve to facilitate social interaction. For example, if somebody breaks your computer and then they laugh at you, okay, that's going to make you feel quite angry at that person. On the other hand, if somebody does something that harms you and you can see on their face that they have a sad emotion, that allows you to adjust your behavior accordingly. So, emotional displays that we give and receive help facilitate our social interactions. So, why do we have emotions? They help us to evaluate our environment to see if we need to change environments or not. They allow us to evaluate our own behavior to see if we need to change or continue our behavior. And they also help us to facilitate social interaction. So, emotions, these evaluative states that affect the way we think, feel, and behave, do have sort of a reason for us. They allow us to evaluate and change our behavior. Now, how exactly should we think about emotions? You know, probably you can think about emotions. There are lots of different theories of emotions. Your book uh, uh, talks about two basic theories, so I'm going to present them here. Um, so one model is this model suggested by a fellow named James Russell, sometimes called the circumplex model. If you look at it, it's right underneath here. It's the one right below me, and it's also in your textbook. And he says, really, if we want to explain and classify emotions, because we have all kinds of different emotions, right? How is happiness similar to and different from sadness? Where does fear relate? How do you organize all the emotions that human beings have? One way to think about it, suggested by James Russell, is this what we might call a dimensional model. He describes emotions as being the product of two psychological qualities. One is valence, which is how positive or negative the event is. So, whether or not it's a happy emotion or a sad emotion. And then we can think about the amount of energy that comes in emotions. Some emotions are high energy and some emotions are low energy. And what he argues is that if you put these on two dimensions, two cross dimensions, like is shown beneath me right here, you can sort of put all of the emotions that humans experience around the outside of these two dimensions to sort of create a model of how emotions arise. So, according to James Russell, emotions are a product of two things: valence, positivity or negativity, and energy in an emotion. So, for example, you can think of the feeling of being excited. You know what? That's a positive feeling, and that's also a high energy emotion. You can differentiate that with relaxed, which is also a positive feeling, but it's a low energy emotion. And so you can sort of put all of the emotions that you might have on this circumplex model. So, for example, if you wanted to say you had the emotion of being afraid, of being terrified, how would you put that on this particular model? Where would you put the model, the emotion of being terrified on this model? Where would we put that? Hmm? What do you think? I think being terrified is probably a high arousal type emotion, and it's also a negative emotion. So we would put it over here somewhere near stressed, nervous, and tense. So that's one way of thinking about emotions. Another way, suggested by a fellow named Paul Ekman, who we'll talk about later tonight if you come to the webinar, he argues that really, instead of thinking about sort of this weird dimensional model, he instead bases his research on international studies that he's done. And what this fellow Paul Ekman uh, demonstrated, at least to some people, there are people who disagree with his model, but he argues that there are 7 basic emotions that we all have that have sort of a set physiological experience. And he argues that all human beings have these 7 primary emotions. Now, how does he demonstrate this? He did international research, and what he did is he would have people from this culture make different emotions. And he took pictures of these emotions, and then he carried them all the way to the middle of Africa, where people had never met Americans or Caucasians or seen the TV. And he asked these people to interpret these emotions. And then he had these people in Africa uh, think about scenarios and make emotions, and he took pictures of those and brought them back here to the United States. And what this guy realized is that there appear to be emotions that exist throughout the world. So a smile is a happy emotion everywhere that you'll find in the world. And so he argues that there are seven independent categories of emotions that everyone can understand and interpret throughout the world. So, for example, can someone please tell me what emotion I'm feeling right now? What emotion am I giving you? Can anybody tell me? Oh, very good. Fantastic. What about this emotion? What emotion is that? Scared, scared, right? I had a little trouble with surprise there. Okay, try this one instead. Those of you who said surprised. Shocked or surprised. Right, right, right. What about this one? What about this one? Angry, right. Absolutely. What about this one? Disgust. Very good, Gloria. Okay, fantastic. And so what he suggests is that emotions are evolutionarily developed. They're these sort of display units, these seven categories that we have. And he argues that these things are so biological that they can be recognized across the world. And he's done lots of cross cultural research to show that people in every country. Now, here's the deal. Each language also uses symbols, but symbols change from culture to culture. So this means something really good in the American culture. This means something really bad in some Asian cultures. So there are lots of cultural differences. Cultural barriers. Well, that's a good question, Andrea. What he found is that aside from language barriers, aside from signs, aside from anything else, the way you can set your face, the way you can set your face uh, appears to be universal and independent of culture? That's a great question. What he argues is that these facial expressions are independent of culture. Now, the signs that you choose to use do depend on culture. Now, Andrea sort of brings a good question in here. Now, there are some emotions that are blends of these primary emotions that you will see that are culturally different. So he argues that we have these secondary emotions. So people, just like Andrea, begin to question the universality of his model and these more complex emotions. And what he found is that we have different culture, different emotions that maybe combine these primary emotions. And he argues that these do vary from culture to culture. And he also demonstrated that although once we all show emotions. There are these 7 universal emotions. He found that there are cultural rules for when we display these emotions. So, in some cultures, if your boss is giving you a hard time, you're allowed to put a sad face on or an angry face on. But in some cultures, you're not allowed to display that particular emotion. So, what Ekman suggests is that there are 7 primary emotions, and these facial expressions are universal and culturally independent. However, there are more complex emotions, and there are times when we can display certain emotions and not other emotions. Okay. Cool. I see that Amin was in Turkey. Oh, yeah. I remember you mentioning that you were going to Turkey, Amin. I hope you had a safe trip. And I'm glad that Sandra's here. We were just talking a little bit about models of emotions. So we've got these biological states characterized by neurological changes that include the way we feel, that affect how we think, and how we behave. They're very useful as knowledge. They convey knowledge to us. They convey knowledge to us about ourselves and about our environment. They also allow us to convey knowledge to other people to soften up and make social relations go more smoothly. Some people say we ought to think about emotions in terms of how much emotion, we ought to classify emotions in terms of how much energy and positivity they have. On the other hand, this guy, Paul Ekman, says that there are 7 basic categories of emotions that are sort of hardwired into the system. I don't know. Now, the weird thing is, older emotions have been the focus of people's interest for a long, long time. And so your book's going to talk about 3 theories of emotion. And what I want you to understand is these theories of emotions incorporate 2 important aspects of emotions. And we're going to talk about these later. The first is how we think. Okay. So when you have an emotion, it causes you to think certain ways, and certain ideas cause you to have emotions, right? So when you see a bear, you think scary thoughts and you feel afraid, right? So, and there's the knowledge that the bear is scary, and there's also the physiological emotion of the bear being scary. Now, back in the 19th century, they were interested which comes first, the feeling or the thought. Okay, because when you see a bear or something that makes you happy, you have a feeling and you also have a thought. Which comes first? Now, William James, if y'all folks remember him from the first week of the semester, he had a theory where he suggested that how do emotions arise? He argued that they arose because we interpret the way our body feels. So, you see a bear, your heart starts beating, you start sweating, and get your hands get cold and clammy, and you interpret these feelings and come to the final emotion, the thoughtful emotion of being afraid. Now, scientists have done a really cool experiment to demonstrate this, right? And it's called the facial feedback hypothesis. So, the idea with James's model is that our body goes through these emotional, these physiological changes, and we interpret that and decide what emotion we has. So if my heart is beating and my palms are sweating, my brain says, well, look what's happening to my body. Let's interpret that and come to a final emotion. So look at this. This is a smile, and that's a sad, frowny face. So researchers gave people a pencil and had them put the pencil either here or either here. Now, if you think about it, right here is kind of a smiley face. Right here is kind of a sad, angry face. Researchers would have people put a pencil either here or here and then have them read comics. And what they found was people who read comics like this found the comic strips more funny than the people who read the comic strips like this. And the idea here is that our body interprets our physiological experience and comes to the final emotion, right? So, how do we become happy? Well, our body engages in happy physiological responses, and then our brain interprets this signal and comes to the final emotion. Does that make sense? So, one theory is that we come to emotions by interpreting our body signals, right? So, now, Walter Cannon, who is famous for coining the term fight or flight, um, uh, suggested that it doesn't work that way. He argued that we get the cognitive label fear at the same time we get the physiological experience of fear. So rather than your body interpreting your physiological responses and create an emotion, he argued that they came at the same time. So if you look in the model over here, the person sees the bear in the James Lang theory. They see the bear, their heart starts beating fast. They then interpret that and say, wow, I'm afraid. In the Cannon-Bard theory, he argues you see the bear, and at the same time your heart starts beating, you put a cognitive label, I am afraid. So he argues that the physiology and the cognition come at the same time. All right. So James Lang argued the physiology comes first. You interpret that and become and develop the emotion. Whereas Cannon-Bard says you develop the emotion and the cognitive label at the same time. But this guy named Stanley Schachter did this really cool study. He argued that if you think about it, lots of emotions share the same physiological response, right? So when I'm happy, when I'm excited and thrilled, my heart beats fast and my palms sweat. When I'm terrified, my heart beats fast and my palms sweat, right? So if you think about it, some emotions have the same physiological responses, and yet we interpret these physiological responses differently. So this guy, Stanley Schachter, demonstrated this study that showed that sometimes people interpret their physiological response based upon the situation, based upon the situation. So he brought people into the laboratory, and let me just simplify this. He gave them sugar pills or he gave them adrenaline pills to eat. Now, he didn't tell them what they were eating, okay? He didn't tell these people what they were eating yet. Well, actually, yes, he did. He told some of these people what they were eating. But what he did was he told some of these people, you're just eating a sugar pill, but he gave some of them adrenaline and some of them a sugar pill. And he put them in a room to wait. And he had a model in the room act either happy or sad. Act either happy or sad. Now, he then had these people fill out a questionnaire telling him whether or not they were happy or they were sad. And what he found was the people he gave the adrenaline pill to, if he didn't tell them they were taking adrenaline pills, they interpreted their physiological arousal based upon the person in the room that they were looking at. So my heart's beating fast and my palms are starting to sweat. The person who's in the room with me is acting angry. It turns out these people interpreted their feelings as a state of anger. On the other hand, if they were in a room with a person that was jumping around smiling and joking, the person interpreted their arousal as being happiness. Yes, exactly what it was, Nicole. It was a placebo effect. So the people who didn't know that they were taking adrenaline, their emotion changed to fit the person in the room. On the other hand, he gave some people adrenaline and he said, hey, this is adrenaline. It's going to make your heart beat really fast. He then put these people into the room with the model who acted happy or sad. And what he found was these people's cognitive label of their emotion didn't change because they knew why they were feeling that. And so what Stanley Schachter said is, you know what? It's not about you having these preset physiological responses that your brain interprets as fear, happiness, or sadness. Okay. Instead, you have these physiological responses, and you judge your emotion based upon the situation that you find it in. Now, what comes first, the cognitive label of being afraid or the physiological response of being afraid? Is it like James Lang, where you have the physiological response first, then the cognitive label? Or is it like Cannon Bard, where you have both of them at the same time? Or is it like Stanley Schachter, where you have the physiological emotion and then you look to your environment to decide what emotion is? Um, I'm not sure which one of these is right, but one of the things I want you to understand about emotions is that there's a physiological response that you can't really manage, and there's a cognitive response that is more under your control. So I want you to keep those two things in mind. Why does this matter? Well, let's look at emotions. Now, one of the things that we do understand about emotions now is that there's what we would call a fast emotion and there's what we call slow or considered emotions. All right. Now, if you look at this picture right underneath me, you're going to see parts of your brain that are responsible sort of for creating this emotional response. You'll notice down here we have the amygdala. The amygdala is what we would call your quick fear and quick emotional center. Your amygdala is responsible for giving you your primary animal emotions, your fight and flight or your feed and breed emotion. Okay, so it's going to give you your primary go forward or run away emotion. So your amygdala is your basic emotional center. It starts to work early in your life and it's your quick emotional center. Now, why do we have quick emotional centers? It allows us to avoid threats as quickly as possible. You see something that scares you and your amygdala quickly you're silly, William Cray. Uh, the water boy quote. I like that. But we have a quick emotional center, and it's our amygdala. Now, we need quick emotions to respond to threats and get away from threats as quickly as possible. Or when we see something, we chase it and eat it really quick. So we have this quick emotional center. Now, this emotional center goes through the thalamus and connects to our cerebral cortex. Now, our cerebral cortex is a slower way of developing our emotions. Our cerebral cortex thinks more deeply about the things we see and feels, and it allows us to remember events that occurred a while back, and we can come to more considered and thoughtful emotions, right? Now, let me give you an example. Has anybody ever jumped out and scared you before? I don't know if anybody watches the Ellen DeGeneres show, but she loves to scare her guests by having someone jump out and yell boo at them. Has anybody ever jumped out from behind a door and yelled boo and scared the hell out of you? Good question, Gloria. Good question, Gloria. Yes, it's kind of the same thing, Gloria. Now, here's the deal. When somebody jumps out and scares you, you go through two quick emotions. Your first emotion, your quick emotion, is terror. You scream and yell, right? That's your amygdala firing off. You then have time to see who it is and realize that this is not a threat, it's actually your friend. You then quickly change from terror to either laughing if you think that that was a good joke or angry at the person if you think they were being a butthead for scaring you, right? Now, the two emotions represent your fast emotional past processing of the amygdala and the slow emotional processing of your cerebral cortex, right? So, as soon as sensory information comes in, your amygdala makes a quick emotional response, and you then adjust that emotional response with your cerebral cortex, which takes a little bit longer to make the decision. All right. So, in a sense, mature emotions involve this quick physiological path, right, that interprets your body, your sweat, your scary, your heart rate, okay, and gives you the quick emotional response. And then you have a prefrontal cortex, which evaluates objects more carefully and comes to more refined emotions. All right, now the quick path isn't under your control as much as you would like it. That's the part of you that sort of is automatic, if you will. Now, why do babies cry? Gloria asked the question about babies and babies fearing strangers. You know, that's sort of a learned response that goes along with this attachment process. But one of the points that we do need to point out is that the frontal lobe hasn't myelinated. This part of your brain where you can control your emotions hasn't myelinated. And this is why 1 year olds, 2 year olds, 3 year olds, and 4 year olds will cry so often. When they get angry and they get frustrated, it comes out as an emotional outburst. However, as your child begins to grow and mature and this frontal lobe myelinates, they learn to adjust those emotional responses. So, mama tells you, no, you can't have a cookie. Your amygdala says, damn it, I'm mad and I want to cry. But then your frontal lobe says, wait a minute, this isn't an appropriate time to have that emotion. And the baby changes their emotion. All right. So, part of the process of growing up and becoming a mature person is learning how to adjust and control your emotions. So, is there a reason why people say it's worse around age 2? You know, I would say the reason we call it the terrible twos, the infant can cry, but the infant's ability to interact with the world is relatively limited, Gloria. But between the ages of 1 and 2, you have all this autonomy and ability. So there are more things you can do. And so there are more ways you can become frustrated. You notice most of the time, those terrible twos is kids throwing a fit because they can't do things. um, at 2 years of age, your ability to move around and control your body far outstrips your ability to control your emotions. So the reason we have terrible twos is because your body can do things, and when your mom or dad tells you no, you can't control the negative emotion that occurs by being frustrated, by having your goals and desires frustrated. That's a great question. But what I want you to understand is even 100 years ago, William James and Walter Cannon, although their theories were a little bit primitive, they understood that there was sort of a physiological or a quick emotional path, and there's a more thoughtful and slow, considered process to emotions. Okay, so we have an automatic sort of emotional part, and we have a more considered emotional part. And the amygdala controls our fast emotional pathway, but then the things that we see and feel and hear go through our prefrontal cortex, which helps adjust our emotions to more finely relate to the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, you'll notice down here I've got the picture of Phineas Gage's skull that I showed you in chapter 2. The weird thing is Phineas Gage had that railroad accident and it destroyed that bar that went through his brain, destroyed his frontal lobe. And one of the things that happened to Phineas Gage is Phineas Gage became unable to control his emotions. He became a grown man with the emotional functioning of a 2 or 3 year old. He couldn't sit down and control his impulses. He got into fights. He argued with people. He couldn't work a job because he couldn't be cooperative with people. So, really, the only thing that was functioning for Phineas Gage's emotions was his amygdala. So he went back and started having the uncontrolled emotional outbursts that you will find with a 2 or 3 year old. Okay. Now, the weird thing is there are people who have damage to their amygdala. Actually, they've even done experimental studies where they destroy the amygdala of monkeys. And what they find is that people who have damage to the amygdala have difficulty with primary, your basic evolutionarily uh, uh, created emotions. So people with damage to the amygdala suddenly can't read those 7 primary emotions. By the way, what is this emotion right here? Can you read that emotion? Can you read that emotion? You better tell me. Come on. Fear. Good God, I should go to Hollywood. I'm such a great actor. Absolutely. So everybody here's amygdala is functioning. Now, in monkeys, what they find is that when they destroy the amygdala in monkeys, monkeys lose their basic approach avoidance behaviors. Monkeys suddenly lose their fear of things like snakes and eagles and hawks that are their natural born predators. Monkeys suddenly start humping inanimate and inappropriate objects. Yes, they start trying to have sex with things that aren't sexual objects. And monkeys actually begin eating their feces. They don't understand the difference between things that are good to eat and things that are bad to eat. So, in a sense, this amygdala is responsible for our ability to interpret primary emotions and our ability to have this primary emotional experience, right? So we have sort of a basic physiological emotion controlled by the amygdala that's automatic. And then we have a more refined emotional center called our prefrontal, controlled by our prefrontal cortex that adjusts and modifies our emotions so that they are appropriate for the situation. Now, what I'm going to show you tonight, if you come to the webinar, is when people try to lie, that automatic emotion part in their brain tells on them. So when you try to lie, you are trying to create a fake emotion. And the weird thing is that amygdala will have the actual emotion, and you'll have to use your frontal lobe to adjust and lie and create a new emotion. And what happens is when people have to control that automatic emotional response, it takes energy from their prefrontal cortex, and then they can't talk as fluidly as they would like to. And people engage in verbal tics and language mistakes that tell on them. So when you're trying to be deceptive, your frontal lobe is having to spend effort adjusting the natural emotion that comes with lying, and that causes you not to communicate as well. And so we can tell when people are lying because they start to make simple communication errors. And also that amygdala causes the real emotion to slip out. You would call that emotional leakage. And so people who are good at detecting deception learn to interpret the vocal tics and vocal mistakes that people make when they're lying because they're trying to control their emotion of fear. And they can also read these little emotional clues that leak out from the amygdala. Okay? Exactly, right, Gloria? Right? So, I already mentioned the basic emotions and display rules, secondary emotions. And so, this leakage is what we call micro expressions. So, it turns out people's real emotions seem to slip out. Yes, this is why poker players wear sunglasses, and this is why, as a poker player, it's important for you to practice keeping the same emotion. Poker players don't get excited when they win a hand, and they don't get angry, because what they do is they try to just stop all emotions, because if you start having emotions, they're going to slip out the side. And one of the examples that this guy, Paul Ekman is actually a master at spotting deception. And what he's found is that people often let micro expressions leak out. So when somebody comes up that you absolutely hate and you know that you have to pretend to like them, you put on that big fake smile. But what Paul Ekman found is when people see somebody that they hate, the first emotion that comes out is the true emotion, and people quickly change that. he found that people's true emotions actually leak out in these quick micro expressions, and then people have to change these expressions. But what he found is that if you get good at evaluating that quarter second micro expression that leaks out, you can tell when people are being deceptive. And you know what? Not only do our facial expressions leak out sometimes, but we actually have micro expressions that involve other parts of our body. So this is a very common expression that we use. Yes, I did this. No, I did not do that. Okay? And the weird thing is, the head shake is an automatic behavior that occurs when we are talking. Do you have a PhD? Yes, I do have a PhD. Uh, do you play in a rock and roll band? No, I do not play in a rock and roll band. The crazy thing is, sometimes when people lie, their mouth won't agree with their head. It'll slip out. So you might say, Chris, did you steal that girl's purse? If I'm telling the truth, I'll say, no, I did not steal that purse. But what you'll see sometimes with people who are lying, you'll say, Chris, did you steal that purse? And I'll say, yeah, no, I didn't steal that purse. Do you see that? No, I didn't steal that purse. What are you talking about? Do you see how I just shook my head? Yes. Chris, are you happy? Yes, of course I'm happy. All right. So, in a sense, sometimes people's micro expressions will leak out even when they're trying to control them. So, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, Gloria, when we talk about lying, is when somebody is trying to conceal something that is really important, like whether or not they committed a crime, whether or not they murdered a person. What you're going to find is that these two competing emotional centers, the automatic amygdala, which follows your true emotions, competes with your frontal lobe, where you can create fake emotions. And what we do when we catch people who are lying is we look for the clues that their true emotional center gives us while they're trying to lie to us and create a false emotion. Does that make sense? Now, one of the things I want to tell you before I let you go tonight is that if you're bringing up a child, one of the things that you need to help them do is you need to help your children learn how to control their emotions. If any of you have ever been around an adult with emotional control problems, you know how difficult it is to have a relationship with somebody who flies off the handle in fits of rage, somebody who gets angry and screams and yells at people. How many of you have a friend that can't, or a family member that can't control their emotions, that has what we call a bad or explosive temper? Does anybody have a friend who has emotional control problems? Anybody, anybody. I have a bad temper myself. It's an ongoing battle for me. I have a classically my family, all my brothers and my dad. We all have bad tempers, and we have all had to work on learning how to control our tempers. Me more than some of my brothers. I at least know that I'm a nut job. My brothers don't seem to think they have any problem, but I know that we all have. It's a huge issue in my family. Absolutely. And it can be quite destructive to social relationships. One of the things I always like to say to myself is, you will not be punished for your anger, you will be punished by your anger. And I found that most of the time, losing my temper and getting angry has never really hurt other people as much as it hurts me. You know what I mean? Uh, um, I don't have you don't have to tell me that I'm being a bad person. My bad emotions hurt me on their own. So just remember, you will not be punished uh, for your anger. You are instead punished by your anger. And so it's very important for us to learn how to control our emotions. Yes, Sarah, it's really weird. You know, people like me who have anger problems, we often point to the world and say, you know what? It's you. That guy did something wrong. That person did something wrong. That person did something wrong. As if we expect the world to be a place where we are never frustrated. Instead, you, the human being, have to learn how to deal with the frustrations that come up in your world. So there's no such thing as a frustration free world. So, because of that, it is important that you need to learn how to control your emotions. And it is a very, very difficult thing to do. Now, how do we learn to control our emotions? Part of it's built into the system. Part of your emotional functioning is genetic. And so it's not under your control, but there is things you can do as a parent to help your children develop. Are there times when it's hard to control emotions? Absolutely. When you're under pressure, when your mental space is taken up with other activities, when you're focused on activities, and you don't have the. Remember, we talked about your short-term memory and your ability to focus your attention. So whenever you have cognitive things in your environment that keep you from thinking about your emotions, it becomes harder to control them, Gloria. So, yes, if you're sick, if you've got things on your mind, if you've got other things that are taking away from your frontal lobe, the capacity of your frontal lobe, it will be more difficult to control your emotions. Yes. When anxiety is in control, absolutely, Ashley. Anxiety is another emotion. You know, anger is a big problem. But an even bigger problem is a lot of people can't control their feelings of anxiety. Absolutely, Andrea. We always focus on anger, but we should focus on that as well. Good point, Andrea. Very good point. So, how do we learn to regulate our emotions? Well, most of us, when we grow up, we learn how to regulate our emotions with our frontal lobe by three main strategies. Three main strategies. One of the ways in which you can control your emotions is by reappraisal. You can look at the situation and realize how it could have been worse or it could have been better, right? How many of you have ever had somebody do something that frustrates you, right? Maybe you made a bad grade on a test and you're really frustrated, but you say, you know what? I still have a second exam and I can bring my bad grade up. What you've done is you've just reappraised your situation. At first, I was going to be angry because I failed a test, but then I realized that I've got other tests and I've got extra credit that can bring that grade up. I've reappraised that situation. My car broke down the other day. My first inclination was to get raging hot and angry. But then I said to myself, you know what? My car is really cheap. It's paid for, and I haven't had a car repair in almost 3 years. You know what? Old cars break down. This isn't that big a deal. So I reappraised my situation. Car breaks down. My amygdala says, get angry, but my frontal lobe reappraised that situation and allowed me to consciously change my emotion. Uh, exactly. Witnessing injustices, bullying, or abuse is a huge anger trigger for me. It is for me too. When I see things that are going wrong, and when I see people get hurt, you're right. It makes me angry. And one of the things, though, that anger, if you feel that anger, Andrea, it can cause you to have a negative emotional state, which affects your well being and your health. So, what we want to do, Andrea, is use reappraisal to understand that something bad is happening, but not let us get angry about it. So when you see a bully, and you might say to yourself, wow, I'm really angry at that bully. But then you reappraise and you say, you know what? The world is full of bullies, and that bully is probably being a bully because something bad happened to them as a child. Now, that doesn't excuse that bullying, and I still know that that bullying is wrong, but it doesn't make me as angry when I understand that there's something that drives that bully. So I've reappraised that. Now, one way to reappraise a situation is through humor. Is through humor. Oh, wow! You want me to tell you? I visit When I visited Colombia this last January. I rented an Airbnb. I'd never been out of the United States before, and I went to Medellin, Colombia. I was going to spend a month working there, right? And I rented an Airbnb, but the guy was not very communicative with me, and I got a little bit nervous. And I got off the plane in Colombia, having not talked to the guy about my Airbnb, right? And when I got off the plane in Colombia in a foreign country, I pick up my phone and there's a message from the Airbnb owner that says, I'm sorry, there's damage to the apartment. I won't be able to let you stay here for a month. And I realized getting off of the plane that I was 2,500 miles away from home and I didn't have a place to stay for the night. Do you know what my first emotion was when that happened? I freaked out. I got so damn angry. But then I started laughing and I said, "You know what? This is a funny joke. Boy, what a pickle. This will be an adventure." So yes, anger. But what I did was I laughed at it. I said, "Holy cow, boy, won't this make a funny story?" And so I used humor to reappraise. And then you know what? One of the things that we sometimes do, have you ever been angry at somebody so you decide to go run or play pool or read a book or drink a beer or do something to distract yourself? This is another way we can regulate our emotions. So, as a parent, it's your job to help your child learn how to regulate their emotions. And you might do that by teaching them these three strategies: how to look at a situation differently, and see the good in a situation, how to laugh at a situation, or how to not focus on a situation that's bothering you, right? So if someone's depressed, are their happy emotions suppressed or frontal lobe malfunctioning? You know, that's a great question, Andrea. Some people, now there's a biological explanation that says that you have low levels of serotonin in your brain, and this is true. This is true. But you can also, in a sense, learn how to interpret your environment in such a way that you don't have the negative emotions. When we talk about stress, I'm going to suggest to you in a couple of weeks that the emotional response of stress uh, is negative and can cause a cascade of negative physiological effects. But how you choose to interpret your environment will determine whether or not you have the experience of stress or anger or sadness. Now, I'm not here trying to blame depression on people who are depressed. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying if you're a depressed person, uh, you have developed a poor way of dealing with life. But what I'm saying is that people who are not depressed have have strategies and abilities which can control these negative emotions that people who are depressed don't seem to be able to control. So we can control to a certain extent. And they have this, if you've ever been treated for depression, your psychologist has probably gone through what we would call a cognitive behavioral therapy, where they try to teach you how to reinterpret the events in your life. Uh, Depressed people tend to see the negative side of things, while people who are not depressed don't always see the negative side of things. So you can get some emotional coaching in your therapist. That's what the therapy for depression is, using some emotional coaching so that you don't feel depressed or you don't feel anxious. So here's what you need to do as a parent. When your child has negative emotions, do not dismiss those emotions. Do not say, shut up, quit crying, don't be sad. You have no reason to be sad. That's what we call emotional dismissive parenting. I don't know about you, but my parents used to use the, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about. That is an emotionally dismissing way to parent. And that is not an optimal way to parent. Instead, what we need to do is identify the emotions that our children are feeling and help our children learn how to use these emotional regulation strategies. So when your child, it's time to leave the park and your child starts crying, instead of saying, "Stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about," say, "Tony, I know you're unhappy because we're leaving the park, but you know what? We're going to come back to the park tomorrow or the next day. So we'll have another chance to come back to the park. So you shouldn't be sad because we're going to come back to the park." Or you might say, "Well, I know we're leaving the park, but we're going to get ice cream. So let's focus on this different thing." So what I could do is I could teach my little 2-year-old Tony to reappraise the situation. We'll come back to the park again. Or I could say, "Hey, let's focus on the ice cream that we're going to get." So instead, if you want to bring children up who can control their emotions, the way you need to do that is not by denying the child's negative emotions, but by identifying the child's negative emotions and helping the child practice strategies to change that emotional functioning. We can't help it when our amygdala is lit up because we are frustrated, because we are angry, because something happens. You can't control your amygdala's functioning. You know what I mean? It does what it does. But the final emotion has to go through your frontal lobe. And so, what we need to do is to learn conscious strategies to adjust our emotion. And we do this by reappraising the situation, by laughing at being 2,000 miles away with no place to stay, by thinking about the ice cream that we're going to eat instead of the park that we have to leave. Okay? So, yes. And in a sense, what you do when you go to a cognitive behavioral psychologist is they walk you through the emotional coaching process like your parents should have done when you were being brought up. Maybe your parents did do it. Okay, but for those of you who are parents, please don't stop. Don't squash your 2-year old's emotions. Instead, name that emotion and teach your child how to work around that emotion. Okay, so that's all I had to say today. Remember that we have a fast part of our emotion that we can't control, but as adults, we need to engage our frontal lobe and learn to moderate or change the initial emotions that we experience. Tonight, in our webinar, I'm going to show you how to spot the emotional leakage that slips out when we are trying to deceive people by changing our emotions. Does anybody have any questions before I close the lecture out? I want to thank everybody for coming today. Ashley, I saw you made a great comment earlier about it's easy to blame others for making you angry, but we have control over our responses to that emotion. Yes, and I don't want to down anybody's emotional experience, but the true enlightened people realize that the emotion that I feel is up to me. You do not control my emotions. I control my emotions. I decide how something makes me feel. But that's a very difficult thing to learn. That's a very challenging skill to develop. And so we need to work on that as often as possible. I want to thank everybody for coming. Have a great day, and I hope to see you tonight at 7 o'clock. You can come the second time if you want to see tonight's deception webinar. Okay. Have a great day, and I will see you tonight at 7 p.m. Take care, folks.